All right, so brief introduction. I'm Caroline Pederson. I currently teach Mandarin Chinese at Arizona College Prep and Castile High School in Chandler School District. A little bit of a context about the trip. As a teacher of Mandarin, I'm a non-native speaker of Mandarin. On this trip, I was with other non-native speakers who had varying levels of language ability in Chinese, from none at all to being able to hold basic conversations to advanced like Grant. For me, this trip in 2019, it had been 10 years since I had last spent any extended time in mainland China. So a lot had changed in 10 years, and looking at the tasks that were needed 10 years later, it was a good opportunity to update my knowledge on that. Finally, it provided a good reflection on what my role is as a language teacher and what my students need to know. So one of the things that really stood out was the need for increased task-based practice with my students. That they listen to authentic materials such as transit announcements, that they practice more spoken interpersonal communication. In listening into conversations among native speakers, they don't always use complete sentences. It's not always precise vocabulary. For example, they would use the word this and that instead of a precise word. And an emphasis on communication over correctness. And then finally, the use of technology had changed significantly. So some of the most needed tasks that students really need to be able to do, as Grant touched on, meeting others and introducing yourselves. And as a non-native speaker, the questions that people ask you are different than they would ask a native speaker. Where are you from? How long have you studied Chinese? Where did you learn your Chinese? Food, obviously, is extremely important to their survival. Electronics was a new area that had changed drastically. Students needed to be able to use words like app, WeChat, download. Once they download the app, they need to be able to find the settings if they want to flip it over to English in Chinese in the settings panel. So knowing significant words like that with electronics. Money, coin, and change. So previously, I hadn't spent a lot of time on the vocabulary for particular coins, but in watching some of my fellow teachers, they would be going through a purchasing transaction, everything is going smoothly, and then all of a sudden the cashier asks a question like, do you have 3 pennies? If their total was $14.03, and that would be difficult for them to handle. So using vocabulary around money and coins with my students. Dealing with a complication in a task is something that I saw in the target culture that students need to be able to do. For example, if the waiter brings them the wrong drink, or you go to a dumpling place 10 minutes before it closes, it's not the rehearsed classroom script of, I would please like 2 orders of pork dumplings. At that point, it's, what dumplings do you have left today? Okay, I'll take those. And this contrasts a little bit with what may be in their textbook. For example, textbooks sometimes focus on describing physical traits. One of the textbooks I use has a section on describing a plant. No one in China obviously asked me to describe a plant that was in front of us. So technology has changed. As Grant pointed out, giving directions on roads, nowadays students are going to take out their phone and see exactly where their GPS dot is and get instructions through their phones. However, what I did find that I needed in directions was directions indoors. I end up asking people things like, where is the restroom? It's down the hall and it's the second door on the right. Nowadays, they're not going to place a phone call to arrange a time to meet with their friends like many of the textbook dialogues still have. Instead, they need to be able to navigate the app WeChat to communicate with their friends. And for those who aren't familiar, it's similar to WhatsApp in many other countries for communication. They need to, when using their phone, there's new areas. For example, they need to be able to understand their phone plan. When they get texts telling them how many minutes or how much data left, they need to be able to read those texts and know what it is that they need and how to top off their phones. Cultural knowledge. So, one thing that had changed significantly in 10 years, previously when I was in China, Google was still accessible, Facebook was still accessible. The government has since gotten more control over the apps market, And those are no longer available. Students instead have to know how to use apps like Baidu Maps, WeChat, VPNs, Yoku instead of YouTube, and so on. So building students' awareness of that and their ability to use those apps. Polite ways to decline an invite. So with our intensive Fulbright schedule, there were times that our peer teachers would want to meet, and knowing how to decline an invite in a polite way. Many students can grammatically correct, say, no, I will not go. And their grammar, their language, their vocab is great, but that's not the appropriate way to decline an invitation. So they need awareness of more indirect ways to decline an invitation. Negotiating prices is something that takes not just language, but a little bit of strategy, knowledge, and skill. Home visits and understanding what an appropriate manners would be for a home visit. For example, tea rituals, wearing house slippers, and so on. And one of the things that this really built for me was understanding and advocating for my students from different backgrounds. So one of the schools I teach at is a magnet school with many first and second generation American students. And when we visited this school here, I noticed that the students, when they did their math, would use a ruler to draw a straight line at the bottom of all their math problems. Teachers in my school had been complaining in this magnet school about how the students needed a ruler to do everything. And so for me, that was that realization and being able to go back and share with those teachers that due to their backgrounds, when they practice with their parents at home, their parents are using rulers and emphasizing the need to draw that straight line there. Or understanding they stay in the same classroom and their teachers rotate in and out. So for our students who are new to the school, understanding that to them, it can be extremely overwhelming to find all their different classes all day long in a high school. Finally, my identity as an educator. So through this program, I was able to see that it, in some ways, is an asset to be a non-native speaker of the language and culture. That through my experience, I know what my students will need to be able to do, and what tasks they would need to perform, what culture they might not be familiar with that they would need. It also drove home to me the need to prepare students for real-world communication. So often in district meetings, it's about tests and assessments, but instead, can they communicate with others? And then finally, I would argue this project showed me the need for frequent in-depth visits for educators, not just pre-service, but throughout their service, and in a variety of groupings like ours, where it's not always all language teachers.